First of all, I want to get away from the dictionary definition of a constitution. A constitution must have purpose, and the purpose must be to create a nation that conduces to the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. That is what a constitution must be. And having set the objective of the constitution, you then frame a constitution to achieve that objective.
Because we really do have a race problem. Those divisions are real. We see it in our politics, we see it in our trade union. We see that they take the divisions with them. Look at where people live in this US. You have enclaves in the Bronx and in Richmond Hill and in Brooklyn. They're taking the division with them.
Women are dying in the streets, and we have a government pontificating running around campaigning for women's vote. No women should vote in this election coming up unless there is something done to the legislation, as Magistrate Kim is advocating.
That voices like ours that are not in the political trench fighting it out, voices like ours should become stronger. One of the things about the Caribbean is that we have never had one discourse. Bass will know the days of the New World and the Old World and the radical left and so on. What we had was this concourse of ideas, which I think in the early days of independence pushed us in a certain direction. We have got to move back to that point of having these multiple discourses.
Good evening and welcome to Globespan 24x7. For all of our viewers who are joining us online, I am Tracey Can, your moderator this evening. And as you can see, our subject matter is plans post-elections. And I'm honored to be joined by these distinguished gentlemen. I have with me the former Minister of Foreign Affairs under the APNU-AFC government, Mr. Carl Greenidge, and the former Minister of Youth, Sport and Culture, Mr. Frank Anthony, and Mr. Timothy Jonas of the recently formed A New and United Guyana will also be joining us a bit later on in the program. Now, as I said earlier, our subject matter is plans post-elections. Gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the program.
Good evening.
Hello, Tracey. Thank you very much. Happy to be able to join you.
Wonderful. It's a pleasure. Good evening.
It's a pleasure here to join as well.
And Frank.
Yes. So before we get into the subject matter, on Monday, for the first time ever, we have a chairwoman of the Guyana Elections Commission. And I would just like to get your reaction on this major announcement. Are your parties pleased, and can we expect a more peaceful way forward as, you know, we prepare for elections? Mr. Greenidge, would you like to go first?
If I might start, Tracey and Frank, I would say that the public as a whole is very pleased with the resolution of the question of the chair person of GCOM, and the Justice Singh has herself got a long and distinguished record within the judiciary of both fearlessness and fairness. So, as far as I'm concerned, the parties, at least APNU, like the public in general, I think is happy, one, at the resolution, and two, at the person. Yes.
Dr. Anthony?
Yeah, I think a lot of people were waiting for such an announcement. And it broke an impasse that was existing in the country, because without a chairman or chairperson of the Elections Commission, it meant that we couldn't move forward with elections. And so I think all Guyanese are happy that we have been able to have this, maybe what you might call mature reasoning and decision to allow us move forward with it. So I want to congratulate Justice Singh on her appointment, and we look forward to the commission meeting and deliberating, moving this forward.
I know she was recently appointed, but the PPP has been protesting. I asked also, can we have a more peaceful way forward, because Justice Singh has not really had an opportunity to really get into the meat of her appointment, of her position, and we have these protests, so has not really been given an opportunity to do anything. Your thoughts on that? To allow her to function, give her some time to function and to do what she needs to do.
Well, from what I saw in the newspapers and the online news, I saw that she has met with commissioners from the opposition and commissioners from the government. And I think it's a good thing to have those meetings first, so that she understands more in-depthly the issues at hand. So I think that's a good start. The reason why the PPP is out in marches and protesting at various sites is a simple one, because stemming from the CCJ ruling, you had a number of things that was in the consequential order, including that the president and cabinet should resign. So that was one of the things that the party was out, for example, today in front of the office of the president, calling for upholding of the CCJ decision, which would have meant that the president should, follow what was in that decision. So that's just one of the reasons why we are protesting. And of course, we would like to see a free and fair elections, and to have the elections date named. So that too is something that is still up in the air. We don't know when that date would be, and therefore it is something that we feel we ought to get the public more sensitized on.
Mr. Greenidge?
Well, of course, the date, if I might start with the last item, the date is dependent on the workings of a number of factors, including the chairman of GCOM. It is out of a process involving the chair and the other members of GCOM that you get a date. So it is unfortunate that one would be protesting about a date. The court didn't set a date. The court said that the process should be in place. One of the things they recommended was a new chair. That has been done. It has not been easy. And therefore, I think whilst one has a right to protest, one also has a need to be responsible, not to wind up the public and not give the process a chance. This is a new chairperson, not part of any old system, and therefore I would urge that we pay attention to that in order that the process could be as smooth and as expeditious as possible.
I would just like to acknowledge, 1 minute, Dr. Anthony. I would just like to acknowledge Mr. Timothy Jonas. He's just joined us of the recently formed a new and united Guyana. Dr. Anthony?
Yeah, I just want to say that I disagree with Mr. Greenidge, because the CCJ did indicate a date, because they said that the ruling took effect from the 18th of June, and that the Constitution stipulates that you must have an elections within 90 days.
Within 90 days is not a date.
That put us the outside date being the 18th of September. And of course, when the confidence motion was passed, it was passed on the 21st of December. So if we are looking at the timelines, we are now far away from that 90-day stipulation. We are close to 200 and something days and counting. So if we're going to respect the Constitution, we must at least try to adhere to it and have that 90 days. Now, with the court actions and so forth, we can argue that we had a reset from the 18th of June.
You can't argue that's a fact.
But you cannot continue to breach that timeline by not wanting to have the elections. And I think that is a very important point.
I would just like
I don't know that you
to.
could say we didn't want to have the elections. What you are faced with is an outside date by which the court is saying you must have an election by such and such a date. It is now July, and we are carrying a battle. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that, and I certainly agree that the court has made a decision, but what I'm saying to you is that the court has said the election must be held by September the 18th, which does not justify you starting a war today on grounds that the election should have been held in December. You know, that is what I'm saying.
We're not arguing for December. What we are saying is, at least now that the courts have made their pronouncements, let us stick to this time frame. And that's all we are saying. So
all right.
we are out there trying to get our points over to people. And I think in a democratic country, we have that right.
All right, I would just like to bring in Mr. Jonas and to have his reaction on the appointment of a chairperson for GCOM. Your thoughts on that, Mr. Jonas, and then we're going to move on to the topic at hand.
Audio.
We seem to be having some issues with the audio.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Is this any better?
Yes, we can hear you now. You can go ahead.
Yes, we can hear you now. You can go. All right, I had to disconnect my microphone, so I'm relying on the laptop. I listened with some interest to Mr. Greenidge and Dr. Anthony arguing and saying exactly the same thing. I wonder why we spend so much time on it. One person says that the outside date is the 18th of September, and he's right. And the other person says the outside date is the 18th of September. We have to have it in 90 days, and he's right. Why do we continue this discussion?
Well, if that is your interpretation of what's the same, then you can understand why it is that we're talking. Because December and September are certainly not the same.
I didn't hear Dr. Anthony refer back to December. I heard you do that. But I heard Dr. Anthony.
He did.
Yes, Mr. Jonas, your thoughts on the appointment.
Right. To protest now, and that the outcome of the court decision is it must be done within 90 days, which is by the 18th of September, which is the outside date.
Right.
Okay.
Correct.
All right. I would just like to ask, we have elections lingering over us, and we're talking about post-elections here. What is your vision for our economy? And in sharing your vision, gentlemen, and of course, by extension, your party's vision, can you speak on 3 priority areas your government would enact to improve the economy, that it would directly benefit the lives of all Guyanese? Because that continues to be an issue. Not all Guyanese are really getting a piece of the pie. So what are 3 key areas that you would focus on, or your government would focus on, to ensure that all Guyanese benefit and live the good life? Dr. Anthony, would you like to go first?
Well, I think looking at the topic of post-elections, I'll come to what specifically you've asked, but I think what is important in a post-election scenario is, first of all, what happens pre-election and perhaps during the elections. And therefore, if we are going to have challenges and difficulties in this pre-election period, and maybe during the elections, then that can certainly affect what happens post-elections. In terms of the specific questions that you have posed in terms of the economy and so forth, the PPP would be putting out its manifesto. And we have sat and deliberated, and we have a number of areas that we have looked at in terms of the economy, job creation, what areas we need to stimulate and so forth. And so that is something that the party would put out at the appropriate time. So I don't want to go into the details of that, but I think the point I made before that was what happens pre and during the elections would certainly affect what happened post-elections. And perhaps we need to look at that, because if we don't stabilize the situation and honor the constitutions and things like that, I think we can have lots of challenges post-election.
Mr. Greenidge?
Well, let me beg to differ by way of emphasis. I think you asked for economic policies after the election. Many things that happened before will affect what should be done after the elections, but many of those will be political. So I don't know that we need to, I'm not going to dilate on those right now. What I would say of the economic policies is that there is really and continues to be an urgent need for economic policies that enhance employment levels. I think if there is one thing you will find across the country, whether it is on the east bank of the Berbice, whether it is at Supernam, anywhere else, employment is a major issue amongst the youths, amongst those well qualified, amongst those not so well qualified. So this is a major issue, and we have to find mechanisms for enhancing employment. Whatever prospectus is put out has to address those. If people are to regard the policies as serious, and the APNU's policies, I think you can expect them to focus on employment, especially of youth, women employment, and related to that is the problem or challenge of training. Because one of the most effective ways of dealing with incomes, and income is a problem in Guyana, compared to the rest of the region and the rest of the world, income levels need to be raised. And the most effective way of raising income levels is to enhance employment levels, to offer employment opportunities. And in offering employment opportunities, you have to recognize that skill levels need to be raised, training needs to be undertaken. We need to tie training as well as education that is offered in a way that is more specific to the job place. Guyana has a preoccupation, even when educational levels were very good and we were proud of them across the globe, they tended to be a lot too academic, a lot too bookish. And you hear that complaint of engineers coming out today. So that is another area in which attention needs to be paid. And if we recognize that one of the challenges that faces our exports now outside of the petroleum sector has to do with meeting technical requirements, traceability, health requirements, and so forth, then you realize that we have also to put more time and effort into the development of science and technology if we are to go any place, and we are to have a labor force that responds to the challenges of the future, where everything is changed. So those are some of the areas that I would focus on and would suggest that you look at when you look at the APNU's manifesto and policies, because these are the areas that the public is calling for and where attention is warranted. There are more general things in terms of a social contract, trying to ensure that people have a say in how perhaps resources and priorities are set. And that has to be done and reflected in a plan of some kind. Otherwise, we'll continue to find the situation. I think this is one of the mistakes we've made so far in not setting a plan out, because people then feel, or they can be fed with misinformation, which suggests either you don't know what you're doing, or you don't have a plan, or things are going to happen and none of us is going to benefit. I mean, this is a peculiarity of Guyana. It is standing on the brink of one of the most fabulous increases in wealth the country has proposed, and you have people who specialize in telling the public, oh my God, this thing is not going to benefit you, it's not going to benefit me, somebody's going to steal all this money and we're not going to get anything. Now, to the extent that one fashions a plan, a national plan, disseminates it, has exchanges on it, dialogues about it before and afterwards, it will make that sort of misinformation less attractive to to the public. But at this point in time, this is one of the challenges we have, that at a time of such good prospects, you have people spreading depression amongst the public. And I think that is unfortunate. That should be addressed.
Mr. Jonas?
I noticed what you stressed in your question, which Mr. Greenidge ignored, but I think that is the key aspect of the question. How do we see development after elections benefiting all Guyanese? All Guyanese. And here is the reality that we know. If the PPP wins this elections that come up, half of Guyana will feel absolute despair, will feel ostracized, will feel excluded. There will be a total revamp of the public service, and the people who have been belatedly put in there in 2015 by the APNU will be removed and will be replaced with friends and family. Contracts will no longer be awarded to APNU friends and family, they will be awarded to PPP friends and family. If the APNU continues and the coalition wins the elections, half of the country will feel absolute despair, will feel ostracized and excluded. And the present regime will continue that contracts are awarded to friends and family, and all the nice high-paying jobs in the public service go to friends and family. We have a winner-take-all situation where for 53 years we have seen a total clean-out the other side and total favoritism and economic benefits given to our own, the people who look like us. So when you ask about a policy that after elections benefits all of us, I'm afraid that you really were asking the wrong two people, because experience has taught Guyanese that the winner-take-all system, which has been exploited by the two parties, has excluded and ostracized half of the country and left half of the country feeling disenfranchised, whichever half that is. Now, it's interesting that Mr. Greenidge talks about employment. I agree with him. Employment is key. But after that, what Mr. Greenidge said is, we need a plan. Now, how ridiculous is it that after 4 years in government, a party doesn't come to say, here is our plan, here is how we implemented it, and these are our achievements. He now comes in 4 years and says, we need a plan, we don't have one yet. Let me tell you about employment.
I don't recall saying that.
You, Mr. Greenidge, please allow me to finish.
So we're gonna have both of you respond. We're gonna have both of you respond. Yes, Mr. Jonas.
I'm sorry, moderator, I didn't hear you. In Guyana, we have an unemployment problem. The unemployment problem cannot be solved just by training and educating, although that is important, because every year we have graduates from UG who cannot find jobs. We have graduates from high schools who cannot find jobs. But what our government has done in terms of the unemployment situation is to let go 5,000 folks from Gaisuko. What they've done is to cause Barama to close down so that another 1,000 jobs were lost. Closed down by Shanlin so that another 800 jobs were lost. What they've done, which is in today's Kaicher News, is to allow Haitians into the country on an automatic 6-month visa, no questions asked. So that the second poorest country in the world, which has an enormous unemployment problem and has an enormous crime problem, has brought, for this year only, 10,000 Haitians into the country, because we don't have an unemployment problem. We know where we're going to employ all of these folks. So the combined efforts of the disastrous economic policies of this government, who talks about employment and needing a plan sometime in the unexplained future, is to kill 5,000 jobs, kill Barama jobs, kill Baishanlin jobs, and then bring in 10,000 folks. I don't know where they're going to be employed, and then to tell us we need a plan. Guyana is in desperate straits. But what is sure,
Mr. Jonas, what would you do differently before
one of the two parties?
Before I ask Mr. Greenidge and Mr. Anthony to respond, what would you do differently?
Guyana has a wonderful opportunity. Our population is small. We can follow the example of countries like Kuwait, Qatar, that have small populations, and understand that foreigners will be coming in here to work in gas and oil. We need to use revenue from gas and oil to encourage low existing industries, to build infrastructure, to ensure that our electricity, our water, our technology is secure, is cheap, is readily available. We need to prevent non-citizens from coming in to benefit that. We need to have a tax regime where Guyanese eventually realize an income tax relief that is wonderful, but that the foreigners who come in, and we know they will come in, pay income tax.
But Mr. Jonas, how do we prevent foreigners from coming into the country?
This money is available for Guyanese. And let me tell you, with the small population we have, even the secondary jobs that are available from gas and oil, the jobs that are available on the offshore, on the onshore base at Munishwar's Wharf, the jobs that are available in the secondary industries, they are enough and they will provide employment. But we need to ensure that employment also is available in timber, in mining, in agriculture, because that is where our expertise is, and that is where we have lived and thrived for 50 years, save and except for poor management by our leaders.
Mr. Jonas, I've heard everything you said, and it's important, of course, that we ensure that Guyanese are priority and Guyanese, gain employment and it's not taken over by foreigners. But let's be realistic. How do we prevent foreigners from coming into the country?
No, we don't prevent them at all.
But that's what you said, so that's why I'm following up to ask.
Okay, if you look at a country like Kuwait, the work that is done in the oil and gas is done by immigrants who come in there for a period of time, pay a sum of money for the visa to work there, pay income tax, pay locals to stay in their apartments and hotels, pay locals to eat in their restaurants.
Yeah.
Those are the things that are important. And the revenue that is derived from royalties from oil is what the government must use to encourage existing industries and provide the framework for economic growth. There's nothing wrong with foreigners coming into work. It's a wonderful thing. Guyanese at the present do not have the expertise, but Guyanese must be trained so that eventually they can take over. But at this stage, the reality is employment will not be a problem if it is managed properly. So far, we have seen no evidence that it has been managed properly.
Mr. Greenidge.
Tracey, I've heard a number of very silly things said. Let me say this first of all. And we're being attributed, comments are being attributed where they weren't made. On the one hand, we're being told, you shouldn't stop foreigners, you should welcome them. But somehow it seems that Haitians aren't in that group. First of all, let me say, notwithstanding what Kaichor said today, there are no 10,000 Haitians in this country. If there were 10,000 Haitians, you would see them, you would know. One of the problems we have is, of course, that our borders are very long and porous. What that means is that people enter the country, both legal and illegally, but it is also the case that those who enter legally often leave illegally or by informal means. And what we do know definitively, why I can say that the story of 10,000 Haitians in Guyana is nonsense, is that Haitians and Cubans, for example, have been entering the country in accordance with the law. Let's say those that have entered in accordance with the law often leave either by the backtrack. Haitians in particular go that route. Haitians have no great interest in coming to Guyana. They come to Guyana en route to French Guyana. We were talking before this program started of language problems. And Guyana is a good place as to why those who speak languages other than English are not that keen on coming here. You could go you can go to Suriname, you will find many Haitians there, but where they head for is primarily French Guyana and elsewhere in the region as far down as Chile. The president of Chile told us in a lift with President Greenidge of how valuable those Haitians are in Chile and how hardworking they are. I hope that I'm being heard clearly there. The second point in relation to these folks in relation to the movement of people, is that I get very distressed when I hear Guyanese start off as Mr. Jonas did in relation to the Haitians. Our country has contributed in no small measure to migration across this region. There is no place in this region in which you will not find Guyanese. A lot of those coming from Venezuela are people who were born in Guyana or they're children of Guyanese. So one needs to be very careful about stoking this fire of foreigners who are coming to take away our jobs, take away our money, or what have you. We haven't even started to receive oil money, and look at where we have gone. The points that are being made are made on the basis of differences, apart from the question of the movement of people, that are non-existent. On the one hand, Mr. Jonas is saying, well, you can't be speaking about improving our lot. You have to look at improving everybody's lot. And he ends up talking about employment, speaking about education, speaking about new industries, and that is precisely what I addressed. Science and technology, the need to enhance our capacity in these areas, the question of making education more relevant, and so forth. And the last point I'd like to make is this, that I know of no government in any country that has never come in a situation in which workers have lost jobs. It is not a peculiarity of APNU. It happened in the 50s before Dr. Jagan came to office. He tried to deal with it, for example, by the way of establishing Black Bush Polder as a way of dealing with the unemployment caused by the closure of the sugar industry. You cannot avoid restructuring industries or businesses because the world is changing around you. People are not interested in buying the same sort of things you were producing in 1956. They're not interested in only buying sugar or sweeteners. So we have to generate new products. It isn't the mischievous of governments or malice of governments that causes industries to be closed. Sugar industries, sugar estates have been closed in this country by all governments over the years. And let us not, therefore, try to fabricate things that are untrue. Okay? The very sugar estates we started off with in 1900 are not in existence now. The sugar estates that are in existence run by Bookers in 1962 are not in existence now. The sugar estates that the PPP inherited in 1992, some of them have been closed. So it is not the malice of a government that looks different or a government that walks differently. Any government has to face the reality that economic development is about change. And if you have a fiscal problem or if you have a market problem, you will lose markets and businesses close themselves. And if they are owned by governments, they will themselves, the governments will have to close those businesses too. So let's be realistic. Don't give the public the impression that there's an easy way out of economic change. You have to deal with adjustment.
Before I bring Dr. Anthony in, I want to ask you something, Mr. Greenidge. Of course, there is a concern that Guyanese will not get jobs in the oil sector because we're not trained. Are you satisfied with the level of training that is going on to ensure that Guyanese are equipped? And I think also you made the point where you spoke about the sugar estate and all of that, your points are noted. But then I think the issue too is that people feel those who are left unemployed, some of them, because not everyone remains unemployed, is that proper alternatives were not put in place for them. Your thoughts?
First of all, you asked about the level of, whether the level of training is sufficient to attract all Guyanese. Of course not. We have a very long way to go in terms of training, a very long way to go. So we don't have to argue about that. I agree. I think resources, greater volume of resources need to be devoted to training. Your education system itself needs to be adjusted, which is the point I was making before. So I agree with you. And the answer is no. Sufficient training at this point has not been done, and it needs to be done. It's an ongoing process. As regards sugar, yes, if you close employment opportunities to any number of people, you're going to find that some are able to find employment immediately. Some may have to even change the type of work they do in order to find new jobs. The training is also relevant there. Also, you have issues, whether it's severance pay, whether it's special incentives to get them to go into sectors where skills are short. This country has high unemployment levels, but it also has a number of unfilled vacancies right across the board. If you try to get a plumber to do decent work and that one plumber turns out to be incompetent or inefficient or crookish, you will be surprised at how difficult it is to find 2 or 3 others from whom to choose. So especially in artisanal areas, whether it is welding or plumbing, we are actually quite short of skills, even though unemployment is high up there, which suggests that greater attention needs to be paid to training. We do have training facilities. I'm not sure that they're sufficient. In fact, I'm pretty sure they're not sufficient, but it is also the case that sometimes people have difficulty meeting the requirements. So you have currently technical institutes, pre-APNU, generated in PPP times, generated before, afterwards, all over the place. But those places are not at this point in time fully utilized, and where they do operate, you can find, as recently when I was in Berbice and some of the folks were discussing the difficulty that young people were finding getting jobs, and we were talking about using the technical institutes, our attention was drawn to the fact that in some of the institutes, there's not sufficient equipment. So persons can be trained, and in that case, electrical installation was one of the areas, and they come out only book-wise. Even though it's a technical institute, they could not do certifiable work in terms of electrical installation. So you have the training facility, but it isn't focused enough, and maybe some of the staff are not experienced enough in or on the job to be able to equip the students to go straight into the job place. So these are the types of challenges we face. None of these things is very simple, but that is the reality. Training is certainly needed, and we have lost a lot of the skills because a lot of the training that you need now, I remember as a Minister of Finance, Transport and Harbours Department had a significant number of welders, very, very significant cadre of welders. You had a foundry in New Amsterdam, you have one at Sprostons. All of those places have closed, even the way they were private businesses. And you have lost those skills. You have to regenerate them and re-attract those skills. So that is the reality.
I'd like to bring in Dr. Anthony. I know you have probably have a lot to add.
Well, I certainly do. Quite a few things were raised. As I said, on the economic side of things, of course, we all know that there have been a loss of jobs. And Mr. Jonas alluded to some sectors where there have been job losses. We know from one of the reports, I think, that there are close to 30 or 40,000 jobs that have been lost over the last couple of years. So one of the things why you're seeing that is that if your economy is not opening up and creating jobs, then we are going to have this type of problem. And I think when you talk to anybody on the road, and Mr. Greenidge alluded to that the problem that people keep repeating to you is that we need jobs. And the only way we can do that is that we have to open and expand the economy. The way that we are going, however, is that a lot of focus have been placed on oil and gas. And maybe there's a reason for that. But I think we are also neglecting other sectors. And if we don't have that balance, what we are going to end up with is what people have been talking about, this resource curse. Because your other sectors, your other parts of your economy would not be doing too well. We are neglecting it, we are not investing in those sectors, and we are all focusing on oil and gas. So that's a danger that we have to look at. And I agree that we have to train, but not only train people, we have to retain them. And in a lot of instances, the quality of jobs that we have and the pay that people are receiving would not allow them to stay. Because if we are going to compete in the global economy, obviously we have to provide jobs where people are remunerated better. So that's something that we have to do. So going forward, I agree that, I mean, we have to do lots of training and so forth, but we have to provide jobs. Now, one of the things that Mr. Jonas said in his opening remarks is that you're asking the two wrong people in terms of jobs and economy. That is something, look, if we really want this country to move forward, there are times when we probably would want to score political points, and there's a time when we probably need to sit down and hammer out what would be the right path for the country, and to build national consensus on some of these things and so forth. So it's easy probably to maybe say when PPP was there, we only look after one set of people, and I heard him mention a very catchy phrase that have been used in previous campaign, friends and family. I don't know, it's nice to say that, but you have to back that up with evidence, and I don't think the evidence is there for that. So if we really want to move this country forward, we have to start think bigger than that. We have to start, really make serious comments that can actually move us forward, and don't drag us back into a place that would keep us stagnating. And I think some of those comments really would keep us in a stagnated way. We ought to start building a country where meritocracy is the order of the day. We have to build institutions where, based on your qualifications and things like that, you get employed. We have to move to that culture. Perhaps we are not there yet. A number of our institutions perhaps are not like that. We have to build that. We have to articulate that culture. We have to have that vision of our country. Because if we don't, and we regress into these types of things, then we are not helping the country to move forward and charting a path for the people of this country. And I think that is what is important. As political leaders, we need to set that tone and provide that vision. And a lot of times that is absent from our discourse because we retrogress into these kinds of things that are not helpful. So the future can be a bright one, but we have to lead that future. We have to chart the way to that future. Yes, some of the things that were mentioned, like in sugar, I think that the current government could have done better for sugar, because a lot of things that were promised in the transition, for example, retraining, creating jobs, giving land to persons, a lot of those things never materialized. One time there was talk of giving sugar workers land so that they can go into alternative crops and so forth. None of those things have come to pass. And if we are going to really help persons and communities that have been affected by the closure of those estates, then we have to do so very urgently. I've gone into some of those communities. People are hurting. People are struggling. They can't provide for their family. This is a reality. And therefore, we really have to find ways and means of how we reach out and help those communities. This government has been lacking in that respect, because there have been quite a lot of talk about what would be done, but the reality is that not much has been done for people in the sugar belt, and maybe in other sectors as well. I just want to point that out.
Well, I just want to ask, because Mr. Jonas did make the point, and Dr. Anthony, you're saying to an extent, as if it's not reality, that there is a winner-takes-all type of system. And when the APNU got into office, for numerous reasons, all are not known to the public, there was a removal of some of certain officials because they were seen to be aligned. And if the PPP were to win and they were to go back into power, a lot of the people that have been appointed by the APNU AFC government, they too would be removed. So there is going to be fear, and there will be a sense of hopelessness from a section of the population if either side wins, and that is the reality. people will feel a sense of hopelessness, because they're saying, and that the thing about it is that they're saying the PPP is for a certain section. I'm not saying that that is the reality, but that is how Guyanese feel on different sides, and the APNU is for a certain section and not for all Guyanese. How do we bridge the gap? How do we deal with this to ensure that the people feel that whoever goes into power, they're for the people of Guyana, not for a certain race? How do we deal with that?
Well, one of the things that we have to do is not to use perceptions as reality. And I think very often we use perceptions, and people who get airtime and promote these viewpoints, sometimes that is what gets traction. Judge the PPP on its record. You go back from 92 to 2015, and you would see that a lot of people were employed. It's not just one group or another group. A lot of people were employed. So that record is there, and you can judge it. So the experience and this thing about feeding a mistrust that if PPP get back into power, then automatically a lot of people would be dismissed. I don't think that's the reality. Okay. And that is what is being fed. So any government, one of the things that we have to understand in this country is that our skill pool is quite small. And if we are really going to advance as a country, then regardless of which political party you belong to or you support, there's a place for you in this country, because we really need your skill to be put to use for the development of this country. If there's any party who has as a policy to eliminate such people, then you're doing your party, you're doing your government a disservice by not harnessing those skills. And that should be our guiding mantra, because we need everybody. And in fact, the arguments that were heard before is not only that we need everybody, but we need additional skills for the new sectors that we are opening up. So this notion, I want to disabuse people's mind, that this notion we're just going to fire people and do this, that's not what the PPP represents. We want to see a country where people who got the merit, who got the qualifications, are going to be employed by those qualifications. And I think that is the way, as a country, we should proceed.
Mr.
Tracey,
Greenidge?
can I just add something to that? Let me start by saying I agree entirely with Frank's comments about the tone and the necessity to recognize that that determines the quality of the debate. The other point is that in looking at solutions, I see someone raise the question of social cohesion. The issue of inclusiveness in the dialogue matters, and tone therefore matters. Tone matters. Now, in the discussion we were having before, we were talking about firing the sugar workers. You know, immediately in some section of the community, you're gonna hear people saying, but bauxite workers were fired. I'm saying governments all have times that they will find, and those who haven't been in government can easily say otherwise, but the reality is that as a government, you will find some time will come when you will have to fire people, and you must not start by treating that as though it is the peculiarity of one government. So it is not only a sugar problem. You had bauxite workers, okay, who were fired in the thousands. But the point of winner-take-all politics is more than just whether governments come in and fire people. Unfortunately, that happens, and I'm glad to hear Frank saying it is undesirable, because it is undesirable. And it means that a country does not make use of the skills it has if it starts off by weeding out people because of the color of their skin or their hair or the political party they're aligned to. So that has to be recognized, and I think we should all embrace it. There's no point in arguing against that. It is to be demonstrated that governments adhere to that principle. The other last comment I want to make has to do with the so-called origin, or the origin of the so-called winner-take-all politics. The winner-take-all politics originated in an electoral mechanism that allowed a party that had a significant representation in the election not to have enough seats in the parliament to reflect its it's support amongst the electorate. And sometimes what happens is governments then feel, and this is what we have to fear about governments that seek, or parties that seek to get 2/3 majority, is that once they have such proportions of the legislature, then, you know, they abuse the power. Part of the problem of Guyana has been executive abuse of power. There's no doubt about that. And so there is some basis for why people are concerned. Let me leave it at that and say, so long as all those in the dialogue recognize that that is a risk, that is a danger, that is undesirable, then we should try and work towards that, because that is the reality. It's not a perception, it is the reality. Thank you.
I'll let Mr. Jonas add, and then I want to come back to the winner takes all system.
Okay.
Mr. Jonas?
One thing I will say about the two gentlemen that you have here on the panel with me is that I have found both to be moderate voices in their respective parties. And I will say that here. Everything that they've said is absolutely true. Guyana is short of skills. We won't go into the reasons about the declining education system and all of that. We're short of skills. And if we are true Guyanese, and if we are patriots, and if we are true to ourselves, we will hire and we will seek to promote folk based on merit rather than anything else. And both of these gentlemen have said that, and both of them have said it with sincerity. Both of them have stopped short of looking the other gentleman in the face and saying, I acknowledge that your party has been doing this, and I hope you acknowledge my party has been doing this. And I think that is what needs to be talked about, because they're right. No Guyanese will dispute it. Merit is what this should be about, and a person should be completely comfortable and completely satisfied and confident that if a job is available, he will be selected for that job based on merit, or he will lose that job because someone else has more merit. The reason that the new and united Guyana has been formed is that hard experience in Guyana has taught us that although there are good people and bad people in both of the parties, the reality is that we have not seen that wonderful ideal manifested in practice. It is very different to speak about an ideal, to talk about a utopia, but when you show a policy, you implement it, you see the reality. And unfortunately, the reality that Guyanese have suffered is that one side feels marginalized when the other side wins. The statement, it is we time, is a statement that has been made by supporters of both sides at various times in Guyana, and it has been borne out by the actions of each government. A new and united Guyana is formed specifically to try to bridge that divide and to provide a system of inclusivity so that both sides have a say at the decision-making process and that both sides are represented so that their supporters have that confidence that their interests are represented in the decision-making process. This is anathema to the winner-take-all system. Hard experience has shown us what happens in the winner-take-all system. Like it or lump it, hard experience in Guyana has brought us to rock bottom because there has been an exclusionary policy. There has been a policy of favoring family and friends. And unfortunately, despite best intentions, this is what our experience has been. So a new and united Guyana is here to say to the people, we have that system, the system doesn't work, and we have to use whatever leverage we can to change it, because this is the reality, that whoever wins, whoever is in power and enjoying the sweet of that power, they don't share.
Gentlemen, your thoughts on the removal of the winner-takes-all system. Should this be a part of a post-elections plan? Dr. Anthony?
I believe that is the wish. Oh.
Go ahead, Mr. Greenidge.
I believe, Tracey, that is the mood of the public. The public said this in the last 3 sets of elections, as far as I'm aware. People were concerned about that. But what I want to say is this, that the electoral system is part of the problem in that it allows executives to do things and not be perhaps sanctioned along the way. They have to wait perhaps until the next election. That is a part of the cause. But in truth, if you believe a political party is inherently bad, let me just put it that way, you have to also believe that it is bad because it is made up of people. Or let me put it another way, you don't solve the winner-take-all politics simply by saying, I have a party that will solve that problem. What is the mechanism? Because part of this problem is at the individual level. It is like traffic out there. Everybody knows the law says you mustn't overtake on the inside. You mustn't cross the line of traffic. And yet people do it. Individuals do it. Groups within parties do it. Groups within governments do it. To solve that problem, you have to have mechanisms of monitoring. The executive has to monitor itself. The party that controls the executive has to task itself with defending its own future by saying, look, we must not allow the executive to be doing these things that are undesirable. Unfortunately, our executives have, for all sorts of reasons, the power to also suborn the parties. In other words, when a man and a group become the executive, ministers and the like. When I first entered politics, let me put it another way, one of the things that used to happen was that the members of the party were called upon periodically to meet, and in those meetings, their charge was to say how the government was doing in their eyes, and the attention to that dimension. How they want to deal with it is for them individually. But you don't fix that problem either by creating a new party. We saw when the FC joined the APNU, that was the FC's charge to try and ensure that the problems of old PPP, PNC politics didn't continue. They are part of the mechanism, very much part of the mechanism, and within the APNU, they are also, APNU FC is quite vocal. But speaking just in public meetings or wherever doesn't solve that problem. And I think, to my friend Timothy, I want to say to you, it's one thing to know what you want to do theoretically, it's another thing in practice. Life and politics are not as easy as they appear. That is my experience.
I think that what Carl has admitted immediately is that after 53 years, indeed, neither party has really made any meaningful step towards that inclusivity that both gentlemen are saying is so important.
Yes, so but there'll be more than one party. That's what I'm saying too. Also,
is that after years of governance under the Burnham regime, in 1980 a constitution was put in which, in fact, concretized the power into one party. And in fact, when there were disturbances under the Jagan regime and the constitution was amended, those amendments concretized the solidity rather than seeking inclusivity. So we have a situation where Carl is saying we must set the cat to guard the milk, because both parties have demonstrated when they're in power, they're not inclined to share. And he speaks about theory, but let me give you the theory now.
Can we pause for 1 second, Mr. Jonas? I'll allow you to continue, and of course, Dr. Anthony has to add. But we have a caller on the line, and someone is calling. So, and they have a question. So I just want to give that person the opportunity, and then we're going to continue, of course. So, remember to share, and you can comment if you have any questions for the gentleman on the panel. You can do so. You can post your questions, and also it's important that we are respectful as possible when posting our questions and making our comments as well. Yes.
No question. I have question. Let's ready. Let me know.
So we have Mr. Rupnarayan. He's on the line and he has a question. Mr. Rupnarayan, you can go ahead.
Sure. Why doesn't Guyana have a stock market so that small investors can raise capital for their businesses? Secondly, knowing that crimes are very different in the 3 counties of Guyana, why don't we have 3 commissioners of police for Essequibo, Demerara, and Berbice each reporting to the commissioner of police?
All right, well, thank you there, Mr. Rupnarayan, for your question. And I'll have the gentleman briefly respond, and then we'll continue with Mr. Jonas, and then, of course, Dr. Anthony to add to the question of the removal of the winner takes all.
Are you looking at anyone in particular?
You can go ahead. I see you're ready.
Okay. The question of the stock market, it isn't true to say that there is no stock market. There is certainly not a stock market of any magnitude or any significant magnitude, and that arises primarily from the size of Guyana, and if you like, the size of the investable capital. Since the 1980s, we were doing work on this, and it continued well into the year 2000. There's been studies on it. We've been assisted by a number of international agencies, the Commonwealth Secretariat, World Bank, I think, amongst them, even UNCTAD, and that mechanism showed in the region. If you go outside of Ghana, you will find that the other countries, although they have larger economies, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, have the same challenge. We need to pool that, the investable resources, in order to make it a viable stock market. The investors involved are too small to be able to provide funding for something like petroleum and the development of major industries. Not that none can be developed, but that you need a wider range of inputs. And the question you make about crime, well, I don't know that that having 3 commissioners of police instead of 1 is really a solution. It may actually multiply your problems if the police are part of that problem, insofar as, for example, resources need to be pooled, because the police force itself is not a very large one. You need specialist skills, and the smaller the units are, the more difficult it is to sustain specialist skills. For instance, even in Guyana, DNA testing and having a sufficient range of medical doctors, labs, and so forth that can carry out those things is a challenge for a populace that is so small. I don't want to give more examples, but I think what you want are labs, for example. You may not be able to afford 4 labs. It may be preferable to have one efficient one that's large enough. We have the same problem with university. Engineering, many dimensions of engineering can't be taught there because you can't even afford equipment for one branch, let us say, of chemical engineering, let alone to look at all the branches of engineering that students may want to take up. So that is the problem of size.
Dr. Anthony, how do you respond to the questions by our caller?
I think they're very interesting questions, but as was said before, there is a stock exchange, and more work needs to be done in terms of expanding it and getting more companies listed and so forth. So that is an area certainly that you need to put a lot more work in to expand it. In terms of crime, we know that it's a big problem in our country, and we have to come up with better solutions of resolving the crime situation in Guyana. I don't think by just changing or having maybe 3 institutional heads that it would significantly affect crime. I agree that maybe the demographics and so forth in the different areas that were named, perhaps the situation there are slightly different. And what you need, instead of a one-size-fits-all kind of situation in solving crimes, you perhaps need to more custom-made, tailor-made the response to suit some of the communities. I don't think we are able to do that as yet. And of course, the way that we respond to crime and the way that we the rates of solving some of these things left a lot to be desired. So we need to do far more in that area. And so to give people that kind of peace of mind that, you know, they can come to Guyana, they can live here, you can, you know, live in peace and comfort rather than having to be bothered by somebody coming into your house or breaking into your house and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, I mean, the headlines every week, every day almost is one of crime, so it predominates our minds, and we still haven't come up with effective solutions. So that is an area that we really need to focus on. I don't think that having 3 commissioners would solve that problem. We have to go more in depth and see and do other things to be able to resolve some of these problems.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to go back to Mr. Jonas because he was speaking on the question of the removal of the winner takes all method, if that should be a part of our post-elections plan. So you can continue, Mr. Jonas.
Let me answer the caller first before I get into that, please. Both Carl and Frank have answered you in terms of the police situation. I don't think that to increase the size of the bureaucracy by creating 3 different heads solves the problem of crime. In terms of the stock exchange, there is a regulatory body called the Securities Council, which gives licenses and has given a license about 10 years ago to an entity called GASCI, Guyana Association of Stock Exchange. That body is the entity in Guyana which regulates the trade of shares in public companies. The thing is that there are not very many public companies in Guyana, and as Carl pointed out, the size of the economy is so small that it's nowhere to be equated with the New York or the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. It is something that happens very infrequently. But your question didn't focus so much on shares and trading shares in a stock exchange. You asked about raising capital. Now, that is not something that you will be able to do on GASCI. The reality is that our banks in Guyana are capital heavy, but they are very conservative in their lending practices. Necessarily so, because the regulatory bodies, through the dictates of money laundering issues and that kind of thing, necessarily have to be careful in how they lend and have to be transparent in those transactions. And because we have always been a very cash-heavy economy, we trade in cash. We don't use credit cards or debit cards. It often happens that someone who may have a good idea for an investment may go to a bank, but because he doesn't have an asset that he can lodge as security, because his name is not known, because he's not a well-known person, he will have difficulty in raising funds. There is a skepticism, and the banks have always been conservative. That needs to change by tax incentives and by schemes by the government to encourage small investments. IPED, it was a product of Mr. Yasu Prasad. It was his idea, and they went a long way to doing that. They have had some moderate success. We need more like that. But there is a lovely scheme from an Indian national which applied in India and extended to Bangladesh, where small loans were made available to encourage cottage industries. And that is something that needs to be encouraged by tax incentives in Guyana, so that the banks can encourage small industries to grow. I think that is the solution. To get back to the theory that Carl was talking about a third party, we have a reality in Guyana that is a mathematical certainty, and given our recent history, you will forgive a lawyer trying to teach maths. The reality, though, is this, that if you only have 2 parties competing in an election, the party that wins will also have the majority seats in parliament, and you will therefore have an elected dictatorship. What we've seen and what our legislative structure shows in Guyana is that when the party that wins also controls parliament because of that majority in parliament, the laws which are passed give all the power to the executive. So that in Guyana, for example, our Petroleum Act, we've had a lot of noise about how oil blocks were awarded. Our Petroleum Act gave the minister responsible for natural resources power all by himself to decide on the allocation of blocks, so that those decisions could be made behind closed doors without transparency. Another example is radio licenses. Under the Broadcasting Act, a board is formed, but that board is appointed by the minister, so that the control lies in the hands of the executive. And that democratic dictatorship, that control by the executive of the parliament, has allowed the consolidation of all the power into the hands of the government because they also control parliament. We had a brief moment of renaissance where there was light at the end of the tunnel and all was possible when we had a minority government, a government that was a minority in parliament, and therefore parliament was for the first time truly independent. Unfortunately, that was wasted, and the AFC, when it had its majority in parliament, which could have done so much, did not did not propose any legislation, any reform, so as to create a system of inclusivity. I'd like to give you the example of central housing. Central housing and planning is created under the Housing Act, and under that act, the minister has the power to appoint the board, which makes decisions as to who they hire, so that the chief executive officer and the management of central housing are hired by the minister. The board is appointed by the minister. So the decisions that are taken, of course, the minister didn't appoint any enemies. So the decisions that are taken by a board that is favorable to the minister. A small change by a majority and a true independent parliament will ensure that both of the large parties have representations in these groups. I want to give you the example of Guyana Chronicle, which is entirely owned by government. Its board is appointed by the government, and they have had a clean slate in terms of employment since 2015. Guyana Chronicle before 2015 was a disastrous institution. It was an institution that did not adhere to any rules of journalism. And I want to remind Guyanese about the statement, Danger Granger and Rivers of Blood. That was unacceptable. And that was something that was done by the national government-owned newspaper before 2015. That national newspaper has now swung full pendulum because its board has been replaced, appointed by the new minister, its journalists have been replaced, its employees have been replaced, and now that same newspaper sings to the present government's tune. If Chronicle, by parliamentary mandate, was run by a board that was represented by the PPP and the APNU in equal measure, and by the largest third party, you would have the end result that all decisions of hiring, all decisions of what you publish, would be done on merit, because both sides, both cats would be watching the milk. You cannot have a system where one of the cats is watching the milk, as Carl is trying to suggest. And the system that I am proposing requires an independent parliament. Mathematically speaking, you will not have an independent parliament if only two parties are contesting this election. If only two parties are contesting, the government will win the majority in parliament and the opposition will have zero. It will be a true winner-take-all situation with absolutely no accountability. Guyana needs an independent parliament so that we can break the cycle that we've been enduring.
And Dr. Anthony, your thoughts on the removal of the winner-takes-all system. How would your party...
Yeah, thank you very much. The system that we currently have is a system that's been employed in many parts of the world. It's the Westminster system. And the way that the system is set up is that based on how many people vote for you, you're going to get seats in the parliament. And the executive is accountable to the parliament. So there are checks and balances. Now, if we don't like what is the existing system, then we must propose how you intend to change that. And you're not going to change that by just saying that I want an independent parliament. You have to come up with a mechanism by which you're going to do so. I recall in 1992, one of the things that the PPP said, winner would not take all. And we proceeded in establishing a number of mechanisms, including boards, where you had representation from other parties. Dr. Jagan used to talk about participatory democracy, meaning that people from other sectors were involved in decision-making of various entities and so forth. Maybe over time, some of that has changed a little bit, but it's one way of addressing this concept of winner-take-all. Now, you've had opportunities in terms of constitutional reform, where we've gone from 1999, and we re-examine the Constitution to see what are the changes we would like to make in that Constitution. And emerging from that commission that was set up, you had close to 200 and something recommendations, a lot of which was implemented. And some of it because there was a lot of discussion about inclusivity in terms of how do we, maybe other mechanisms, to create other mechanisms to include everyone in decision making. And those recommendations were made. We went across this country looking and talking to people to get their suggestions. And then that was harnessed and put into these recommendations, a lot of which was implemented. My thing is that if, and I don't think we can all agree that we don't have an ideal system. I don't think any part in the world you'll find an ideal system of governance. So we can all say that, yes, what we have, if it's not working, let's see what we can do to fix it. But we have to come up with concrete solutions of how we are going to fix it. What is it? Is it that we want to change the mechanism of how we are electing people? Is it that we want to change the list system? What is it that we want to do? And you know, those are the kinds of concrete suggestions that would aid a debate in terms of moving forward to see whether there's merit or demerit. But the basic concepts of government is that government must be held accountable by its parliament. If those mechanisms are not functioning properly, then what exactly we want to change. One of the innovations that we made was to have parliamentary select committee. I would admit that more needs to be done in terms of how they work. And because in some cases, some of these committees have not met for a long time, so the work is stymied. Now, if that is one mechanism, then we must move the other step of seeing how do we make these things work. But it's nice that we can talk about inclusivity, but we have to zoom in into what we mean by that, and figure out how to be able to make a better system. I don't think we have a perfect system. As Mr. Greenidge alluded to earlier, sometimes executives or the executive government tend to abuse some of the powers placed in its hands. And one of the things that we can probably talk about, which is happening currently, is that you have the CCJ that would have said that the government must resign. And that's quoting from Article 106.6 of the Constitution, that the government must resign after no confidence motion. They found that the no confidence motion was valid, and yet the government has not resigned. The president has not resigned. Because in my view, I think in terms of they have to resign first before Article 106.7 kicks in to form that caretaker government. Now, the president has admitted that they have an interim government, but saying that, but not fulfilling the requirements of the court decision and honoring the Constitution, then puts us in a bad light. So I think these are things that we have to guard against, and perhaps when we were framing the Constitution and looking at some of these mechanisms, we did not specify how to trigger some of these things. Now that we are in this situation, we have to address it so that in future, when these things occur, it's not left to anybody guessing what to do. This is what has to be applied. And I think that is something that we need to stem any abuse of executive. And there are various ways of doing that.
I know Mr. Greenidge wants to add, but we have a caller. Mr. Greenidge, 1 minute. Before we continue, we have another caller. And let's just hear from this person, and then we're going to continue. And also, while Dr. Anthony spoke about the caller is ready. Yes, caller, go ahead. You're on air.
Hi, a pleasant good night.
Good night.
Good night, sir.
Caller, are you there? All right.
Yes,
so
I am here. A pleasant good night, Tracey, and to all the panelists. I have a for panelists.
Go right ahead.
Yes, I have a question for our panelists regarding jobs for our young UG graduates in Berbice and other people, and we know that there are major issues in Berbice. Yes, I am.
What is your question? What is your
My
question?
question is jobs for young people in Berbice and more so the UG graduates. And my second question, why to date?
We seem to be having some technical problems with that caller. So we're gonna.
Some interference. Another voice.
Yes, there seem to be. All right, so we'll go to that question, but Mr. Greenidge, you wanted to respond, and then also I want to talk about political maturity. If you gentlemen believe that our political leaders are exercising that, and how important it is that we do so, especially post-election, to accept the will of the people, whatever that is.
Let me respond to some of the comments that were made earlier. And what I wanted to say is that from the comments of both gentlemen, it is clear that there is a recognition that there are areas to be addressed if the concerns of the public about the winner-take-all and its manifestation are to be dealt with. And I think this is a very important area, and it is a pity that one doesn't have all the time that such an examination would require. But I just wanted to say a couple of points. One is, we have had attempts at constitutional reform, whether they be undertaken by one party, and more importantly, when they were undertaken by all the parties in 1999, and we have still ended up with an incomplete, in my view, constitution. The constitution and its drafting, I don't want to go back to Article 106 or anywhere else. In economics, you would say that it is internally inconsistent. In other words, it requires actors to do things, but that isn't the only way that the thing could be done. So you end up with people reinterpreting or giving themselves room. So that is a problem. But I think the real point I want to make is that it's not so much today the mechanics of the election itself that is a problem, although I'm sure that if you were to go back to the constitutional reform, people would want to focus on that. But the power that the executive exercises in terms of, if you like, administrative and other control, both of the parliament, and it controls the parliament by way of the parties. Okay? So MPs aren't independent in the party. And we have had more than two parties, so it isn't the case that it is only two parties. What I would say is that you have to look at the workings of the system. In other words, in the appointment of those who are supposed to be guardians at the executive level, do we have a system that prevents, let us say, whether it's ministers, president, or whoever on the executive side, from imposing decisions by whether it is officers in the public service, police, or whoever else? These are some of the areas. In other words, the appointment of some of the key personalities. Before '92, one of the big problems, or in the early '90s, one of the big problems was over, say, appointment of judges, appointment of commissioners of police, these sorts of areas. Now, it was being suggested that one of the things, and this is by Timothy Jonas, I think he's focusing on a point that is important here. If, for example, in some of these appointments, there was a mechanism, he was using the example of the board, Chronicle Board, for example, you have a mixture of representatives of political parties, then the board would be able to exercise more effectively its powers. Maybe that is true, but it is striking the balance that is usually a challenge, because we have had, when I was Minister of Finance, with responsibility for the appointment of GuyStat boards, COFA boards, all those boards, opposition members were on. Of course, the numbers is another issue. You may have 4 government members, 2 from the trade union, 2 from somewhere else, 1 from somewhere else. But at the end of the day, the balance is such that those numbers can be manipulated. So that is what I mean sometimes when I say there's a problem between the theory and the practice. People are the agents that run the systems. And the question is how you can find some rules. And I don't think we pay enough attention to that. The rules governing board members on government-owned boards are non-existent. They're non-existent. In many places, and a lot of attention has been paid to this in Britain, for example, I see Barbados has in some cases tight rules that require members of boards to operate within fairly tight rules. I think that is part of the step that could take us forward. So you may want to have not such a great balance on government side in relation to some of these areas when appointments are to be made, or the role of the minister. In truth, whilst minister has the power, the point was being made about the oil blocks. All of these ministers are supposed to do things with an eye on due process, and I'm sure as a good lawyer, Timothy knows this. So the question is, how do you give effect to that? When the legislation says a minister shall, it doesn't mean that irrespective of what the rest of the world thinks, I'm authorized to just appoint someone. It means that you should have a set of representatives that advise you on these things. That is what's supposed to happen. But of course, how do you reconcile or resolve differences when they arise, either within your boards or between the minister and the more problematic members of the board? I think these are the details that we have to pay attention to if we are going to achieve the sorts of concerns, elimination of the concerns that are raised. It isn't likely to be a completely new system you're looking at. It's likely to be refining those elements of the system that you recognize as valuable, how to make them perhaps bite, how to make them more effective, and how to ensure that when they're working, elements of them can be changed. So it's not quite as hopeless a situation as perhaps we might have started out in looking at when we're talking about winner take all. There are areas and levers that we need to address.
Thank you very much. It's unfortunate that we are out of time, but of course, such an interesting, such an interesting conversation. Of course, I'll have you gentlemen with your closing remarks, and we also have a poll to announce that we will announce, and we have a member of the in-studio audience with a question. Then we will go to the polls and brief closing remarks, gentlemen.
Well, happy good evening to all. I want to ask a question, and that question really it's to do with what you're doing in order to, we're talking about post-election plans. Here, we as the diaspora, we're talking of American Airlines flying directly to Georgetown, Guyana from JFK. We're talking of Fly Jamaica being acquired by a French company. These are the exciting things that people want to hear about. They want to know about the oil well being translated to get jobs for the youths. How and what mechanisms are in place. The idea of the university being tuned up to be able to talk about oil so we can have future leaders in place to make that difference. These are things that we're looking to hear. Those are the plans we're looking to get meat on. So with that, you guys can add some comments in your closing comments.
All right. So your closing remarks, and of course you can respond as well, because we're really out of time, but we're stretching here. Big thanks to Globespan 24x7 for this platform. So it is up to me to say who will go first. All right, Dr. Anthony.
All right, thank you very much. I think we had a very interesting discussion. To respond to your in-studio guests, the question that he posed, I think all of those things that he mentioned, we need to look at. But, you know, for us, I think you will see a lot of that being unveiled during when the parties put out their manifesto, and certainly when the PPP put out its manifesto, you will see a lot of those things being addressed. So we don't want to be premature and announce some of the measures that we intend to take. You will see from time to time when various leaders of the parties speak that they would address some of the concerns on an ongoing basis. But I'm sure you will see it in a more comprehensive way in the manifesto document. So perhaps if he would wait a little bit more, I think you will see that shortly. My concern, though, as I said earlier in my opening remarks, is that I think it's a bit premature to talk about the post-elections, what would happen post-elections, because post-elections really depends on how we manage this current period and during the elections. I think right now there's a little bit of optimism with the appointment of the chair of the GCOM, but there's still quite a lot of distrust and there's still quite a number of issues that are still pending resolution. One of which is the house-to-house issue. This whole and while in the discussion, Timothy spoke about the Haitians, but look at it from the point of view of employment. There's another dimension to that, because there's a lot of people who feel that some of these Haitians are being registered and would probably be allowed to vote in our process. So if this is so, then that raises a very important dimension. So these things are out there, and it comes back to how we manage. How do we manage this period, and how do we manage during the elections that would result maybe in what we look at in the post-election period. So this is really key and critical. What we do now would depend on the kind of outcome we'll see down the road. And just before I go, I just want to wish everyone a happy emancipation, and I want to salute the sacrifices of our ancestors who helped to build this country, and on whose sacrifices we are all building upon. So I think tomorrow is a very important day in our history, and one where not only should we celebrate, but we should be reflective of where we want to go as a country and what we need to do to get us there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony. Mr. Jonas or Mr. Greenidge?
Carl, you'll go first, or you want me to go first?
No problem. I'm happy to go just before you, Timothy. Very quickly, of course, one would join Frank on the sharing best wishes as regards emancipation. I don't want to add to that. I would also say that whilst at this point in time it may appear to the parties that it is too early to divulge the secrets for the post-election period, except perhaps to focus upon, if you like, the political story now, I would say that the electorate should call upon the parties to divulge those things. They must discuss them. This is part of our problem. And as regards the specific questions that were put as to perhaps what vision lies ahead, I would say that, of course, the diaspora's preoccupations in a lot of the areas are areas that will have to be addressed by whoever wins the election. Infrastructure is very, very important in investment. Infrastructure is critical. It's perhaps even more important than a stock exchange per se, because it does affect inward investment. It does affect returns to investment, and it makes it a problem even to as a Guyanese coming back when you are relegated to the very unsociable hours in terms of the shifts. So this is a big issue for us. Air transport is very important, but domestically, of course, infrastructure of all types are going to be the areas that attract money and funds and attention, because infrastructure is also needed to develop the oil sector in particular. And with the funds from the oil sector, if the investment is undertaken across a range of infrastructure, then the opportunities for the other sectors to develop will be greater, because they depend very much, whether you're moving rice or more up-to-date products with a more buoyant market, such as fruit and veg, will depend upon that infrastructure. But the other area I want to say, especially since this is raised by diaspora, is that the question of attracting skills must also be an important area, and retaining them. And I agree with Frank in relation to the question of pay structures, and mechanisms for labor incentives. This has to be an area that we pay attention to, and we will have in the future also to pay more attention to labor laws and the operation of international companies, because if you allow them to come and run roughshod over the public, you're going to be thrown back into an area, because Guyanese workers are not particularly easy. So we have to pay attention to that before it gets out of hand. And I think these are exciting areas. Let me just end with a comment on the Haitians again, and to say to you, I'm now speaking as an APNU, AFC representative, as it were, here more specifically. That is that it is fashionable to see a phenomenon and then attribute bad motive. It's easy. You know, before the Haitians were coming, you had lots of Chinese, and allegations were made about the Chinese being used to vote for the government in office at the time. Let me say that there is no intention and there is no mechanism for recruiting Haitians to vote. Nothing of the sort. As I said to you, if you look carefully, you will see that the Haitians are, by and large, heading elsewhere. And you can see more Venezuelans about Guyana, whether it is in Anai, or at the Pegasus Hotel, or even Marriott, or on the streets, than you can see Haitians. So let's bear that in mind and don't get it out of kilter, but also remember that we are part of a regional community. And our success in this community, in attracting skills, in finding markets, and in getting support for our territory, because in the end, you can have all the oil you want in a space if that space is seized by somebody else, because people are not supporting you. You don't have a country. So all of these things are interrelated. Policy is not policy in one area alone. Migration policy is related to regional integration. It's related to our international diplomacy efforts. And I beg that we focus more sympathetically upon the question of migration and not take an incident or a report and use that report to beat up upon other people, and we will find that we are flagellating ourselves. That's what I urge.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Greenidge. Mr. Jonas, your closing remarks? I'm
surprised that both parties were so vague and spoke at such length on the question of economics. The reason I say that is I've heard representatives from their parties be so short and direct and forceful. I heard Irfan Ali declare clearly that he will create 50,000 jobs. I heard camera drop.
That's the privilege of being out of office.
Why does my friend drop? I heard camera Ramjutan and Moses Nagamutu tell rice farmers they'll get $9,000 a bag for their paddy. I thought that those were direct promises and that should end all problems in Guyana. But that being said, I do agree with what Carl says. We need infrastructure. We need bridges, roads, train lines. We need to access our agrarian, our mining sectors, our agriculture sectors, and we need to do so easily. So much is spent and so much time is wasted by logging trucks trying to negotiate those impossible trails, by farmers in the Backdam and Blackbush polder, all the way over in Essequibo, that have to cross the Essequibo River, get to Parika, cross over to Reed and Hope, get to a port just to export their product or to get their product to a market, going through backdams and trails. We need to fix our infrastructure. We need to have cheap electricity so that those same raw agricultural products can be processed. We need agro-processing, and we need a clear and transparent and efficient system of export that helps the farmers rather than creates a bureaucracy to hinder them. We need clear rules as between rice farmers and rice millers and export processes, and we need clear customs guidelines, and we need a system that helps, not a system of bureaucracy that hinders. Now, I went up with Anag to Essequibo recently. Essequibo is an agrarian sector. It is an enormous country. It is a beautiful place. But from Charity going up Pomeroon is an enormous agricultural sector, and they have nowhere to carry their produce. If you go the other end, going up Quarantine or going up Tamara, you have agricultural societies that have nowhere to carry their produce. Nothing has been done for these people. Nothing has been done to help them. And any revenue that we get from oil must be spent to fix our infrastructure, to fix our technology, to fix our internet, our telephones, to fix our systems, so that we can learn a manufacturing process. We have cottage industries that are being formed. We have kiln-dried wood now that is coming out rather than raw lumber logs going out. But they are being crushed by heavy unfair taxation systems, by tax exemptions given to foreigners rather than given to locals. So we need a fair and transparent system of taxation, a way that encourages investment and encourages those cottage industries to grow into something large. We are not seeing that. The reason that we are not seeing that is that a government in power that also controls parliament stops thinking about that. And I want to go back to the reason that the Known United Guyana is here, because you had asked me to discuss that. And interestingly enough, Carl agreed with this concept, that these boards cannot be controlled by the minister because we will continue to have secret deals and a complete control by government. These boards of Guy Oil, of Chronicle, of all of those entities, EPA, GEA, all of the entities, they need to be represented, not controlled by government, but represented equally by the two large parties, with the largest third party being involved so that there is inclusivity. Guyanese have had enough of winner take all. Our side is excluded and feels despair, or our side is triumphant and we enjoy seeing the other side shackled and brought before courts on charges. Guyanese need to feel that we are all represented by the government, and the only way that can be done is by an independent parliament. We have learned over 53 years we cannot rely on either of the two parties when they are in power to generously, like Santa Claus, say to the other side, come on board, we will share power with you. It can only be done with an independent parliament that involves a third party, because mathematically speaking, two parties do not create an independent parliament. Thank you very much, Stacey.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, so much. It was a privilege to sit and to have this conversation with you. And we're hoping that we can continue this, because I have so many more questions. And I must say, a lot of political maturity was demonstrated as expected. We're so thankful that you were on board. To our viewers, we thank you so much. We have some members in the studio here at this hour in Queens, sitting down and listening and making their comments as well, adding, agreeing, disagreeing. And we must say a big thank you to the team, Globespan 24x7, for the platform where we could have these conversations, agree, disagree, and educate the public. And on behalf of Globespan, a happy emancipation to all Guyanese. We hope that you all will have a wonderful day tomorrow. And we have the results of an online poll. I had so many other questions, but I guess we'll continue.
We have asked the online audience, are you pleased with the choice of Ms. Claudette Singh for chairperson of GCOM? 86% responded yes, and 14% responded no. Thank you.
So the online poll question was if Guyanese are pleased with the choice that was made for the GCOM chairperson, and it was 86% agreed. So majority of Guyanese are happy with the decision, and everyone on the panel as well agree that it was the right decision, and I'm all for a woman. We had a lot of comments where we should have more women on the panel.
Careful, don't overdo this now.
Yes, we had a lot of comments that we need to hear more women. The men are always talking. I didn't say that.
I think it's probably a historic appointment as well, because I think she might be the first woman chairperson of GCOM.
Yes, indeed.
That is a fact.
Yes, it's a big win for the women of Guyana. I will end on that note. Again, gentlemen, thank you. It was a pleasure speaking to all three of you. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Okay.